inches, I think. What
Yeah.
about up there?
Yeah, it's at least 5, probably a little more than that, at least at our house.
Yeah, the wind's starting to blow things around right now, so there's some drifting going on, but
Yeah.
not as bad as they said.
Yeah. Well, it looks like it's going to be worse on the eastern plains, especially heading towards Nebraska. And we've got a water extension specialist that works for us. He's shown pictures of him plowing out his driveway, and this is going to be just as bad. So
Yeah.
we'll get more entertaining pictures coming from Joel. So
Yeah.
yeah. Okay, so hopefully everybody had at least an ability to get a little lunch, a little nourishment. And we're going to be back for the afternoon session where we have 2 additional speakers. We're going to have Emily Hunt. She's the Deputy Infrastructure Director for the City of Thornton, and she'll be speaking about Thornton's Ag Water Stewardship Program. And then after Emily is going to be Tim Gates, who's a professor in civil and environmental engineering, who's done a tremendous amount of work over his career looking at issues of salinity and ag water management and all sorts of things of both water quality and quantity in regards to water and agriculture. And so we're going to start this off by having Emily take over the screen and provide her presentation. So Emily, do you have a presentation or are you just going to talk?
No, I've got a PowerPoint, so I will take over the screen here.
Yeah, grab the share, and Benton, any technical issues, Benton can help you through it.
Yeah, just I got to make sure I'm sharing the right screen here. So
yep, that looks like it.
I want to get to the right mode. I never know how to show the whole screen versus the. Maybe I just do show slideshow, huh? How's that?
That worked.
Great. All right. Well, now I can't see any of you, but I guess maybe Benton and you folks, if anybody has a question as I'm going along, feel free to just kind of interrupt me. I think I will be able to get through this with some time for either questions or discussions or a little mini break between the next presenter that you guys have. So yeah, my name is Emily Hunt. I'm the Deputy Infrastructure Director with the City of Thornton. And thank you so much for the invitation. Water Literate Leaders is just such a great program. And I'm always thrilled to see how many people take advantage of the opportunity to go through this program because water is so important and so complex that I think it's just really great to have people kind of engage at different levels. So I'm happy to be here. I want to talk to you today a bit about Thornton's work up in Larimer County and Weld County as it relates to our water rights as well as our agricultural activities. Just a little bit about me. I've been with the city for over 23 years. So I've been there for a long time and I'm a Colorado native. I went to school at CU Boulder, so don't boo. I can't see your thumbs downs right now, but I was a geology major there, and then I went over to DU to study kind of like fluvial geomorphology, which is really just like the way that rivers move. And I started Thornton pretty much right after grad school. So anyway, that's a bit about me. I'll keep moving on here, I think. So I'm sure a lot of you have some version of an understanding of Thornton's presence up in Larimer and Weld County. We've certainly been more active in the recent few years, and so you've probably seen us in the newspaper or that sort of thing. But I want to back you way up and give you a little bit of a history lesson as to how we found ourselves as water rights holders in the Poudre River Basin. So Thornton is kind of a newer city. We were incorporated in the 1950s. We're just located just north of Denver. If you kind of pass us, if you come down I-25, the city was not allowed to go on to Denver Water kind of as one of their extraterritorial service providers. So very early on, we had to get in there and start developing our own water portfolio. So in the mid-60s, we acquired the existing utility that was serving the area that the city was incorporated in. And the water rights that we were using as drinking water supply were Clear Creek surface and South Platte well water supplies. So through the 70s and 80s, we kind of continue to develop those adjacent sources to us by adding storage, by acquiring additional water rights and that sort of thing. And then in 1982, we decided to invest in the Two Forks Reservoir Project. I'm not sure if many of you are aware of this. This is a big project that was spearheaded by Denver Water, and it was an on-stream reservoir project in the South Platte Basin. Thornton was set to acquire around 13,000 acre feet of supply from Two Forks, and that was going to be the source of our future growth. So then in the mid-1980s, as Two Forks was developed, this was kind of just at the cusp of the big environmental movements that were moving through the United States. And Two Forks was getting a ton of pressure from the environmental community and others in the region, that were really against additional on-stream reservoirs. And so by the mid-80s, Thornton was kind of tracking this, this trend and saw that Two Forks was beginning to falter, and whether it was really unclear as to whether or not the project was going to be successful. And then the other thing that was going on was that our South Platte water supply was starting to really, well, it had been degrading, but it was continuing to degrade. We're below the Denver metro area. We have really difficult challenges with urban runoff. Basically, just being below a significant municipality is not a desirable place for a water supplier to be. You typically try to chase down the most pristine sources so that you can really protect the health and safety of your water customers. So our South Platte water supply was degrading even more, and Two Forks would have just added more South Platte to our system. And so between the fact that it was kind of teetering and we continued to have this water quality degradation, in the mid-80s, we divested ourselves of our interest in Two Forks and sought out a different water supply for our future growth. The city eventually landed on water shares in the Water Supply and Storage Company system, which is a very robust ditch company system in the Poudre River Basin that has all kinds of really amazing attributes to it, including senior water rights, trans-mountain rights, storage in the high mountains, as well as plain storage. And so the city began acquiring water shares in WISC. We call it WISC for short. So when I'm saying that, I'm talking about the Water Supply and Storage Company. And we also acquired the farmland associated with those water rights. So what you can see on the screen here is, get you oriented a little bit. You see the Cache la Poudre River coming down out of the west. This is kind of at the far western border of this map is kind of the canyon mouth. And it goes not quite to Greeley, but you can kind of see the Cache la Poudre running out of the canyon mouth down towards the southeast. The dark blue line to the north of the Cache la Poudre is WISC's main canal, and it's called the Larimer County Canal. And you can see that it goes from the canyon mouth all the way out to the plains, to past Highway 85 to the towns of Alton Pierce. Let's see what else to highlight here. You'll see all of the reservoirs in the area. The ones that are outlined in pink are the reservoirs that are owned and operated by WISC. So those reservoirs are used to deliver WISC share water. And then as you move out to the east, you'll kind of see some brightly colored laterals. Those are all the local irrigation laterals that come off of the Water Supply and Storage Company system. So like the Collins lateral and Pierce, that sort of thing. The other thing to note on this map are all of the greenish squares. Those are the properties that Thornton acquired, as we also acquired the water supply that was used to irrigate those properties. So we are a significant landowner in the region. We acquired around 20,000 acres back in the mid-80s. We currently have around 18,000 acres. You can see the bulk of the acreage is in Weld County. We own just over 17,000 or around 17,000 there. And then about 1,500 is what we own in Larimer County. You can kind of see it doesn't between that dark blue line and that kind of that brownish line. that generally describes the water supply and storage company's service area. So the area that isn't in green is basically other WISC shareholders, other municipal shareholders, as well as irrigation. But that kind of shows you the service area of WISC. So this is a really significant project. We've obviously been working on it since the mid-'80s. This just kind of shows you a bit of a timeline. You know, we had the acquisition in the '80s. In addition to the acres and farms we acquired the water rights, and we also acquired all of the farmhouses, wells, and other assets associated with the properties. From 1985 to the present, we've been in active stewardship of those properties. Much of the property is continued to be irrigated agriculture. We cash lease with local farmers. We have begun the gradual conversion to self-sustaining or native grasses. That began back in the 2000s. I think you guys heard from Brett Bovee earlier today, and I imagine he was I think I saw that he was talking about alternative transfer mechanisms. So you're probably pretty familiar with the requirement that irrigated agriculture, irrigated land that has had the water supply removed from it by a municipality, you have to transition that land typically back into some sort of non-irrigated use. So that's what our stewardship program has been. We actually have an office in Alt. We have 3 Thornton staff members who all live in the local Alt Eaton area, and they essentially run our ag stewardship program, managing those farms, working with our farmers, working with local vendors to keep the irrigation equipment and the rental houses all in good shape.
Yeah, Emily, we have a question.
There's a question. Hold on.
Great.
Go ahead.
Yeah, Benjamin, take the floor away.
Yes, thank you. Emily, on that top bullet point, I'm the Economic Development Director in Greeley, just for reference here.
Oh, thanks for the introduction.
And we appreciate you presenting to our class. Of those 284 during that buy-up period during the mid-'80s, what percentage does that represent of this storage, supply and storage company? Because it looks like from a landmass standpoint, Thornton's got a pretty significant
yes.
share of that. Does the water match up with that landmass? Is it like half? You own like half of the shares?
It's just under half of the shares.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
That's a great question. Thanks for that. I'll keep going, but yeah, if you can just pipe in and interrupt me because I can't see hands raised or anything. So that worked great. In the mid-'80s, after we did the acquisition, we spent a really fun 12 years in water court. Went to water court, had over 30 objectors to the case. The water court ruling was appealed to the Supreme Court. It's a very famous case, Thornton v. Bijou, that every single Colorado water law student learns about. The Supreme Court remanded the case back to the water court, which means they gave the water court some specific guidance on how to hear or how to consider some of the contested issues. And then finally in 1998, we obtained our final water court decree on remand. And it's about a 4-inch document, and it is essentially the recipe book for how Thornton can use the water, what requirements we have to meet in order to use the water, as well as kind of these revegetation requirements. So that's the water court piece. The Thornton Water Project piece is what you've been hearing about lately. That's simply the pipeline project to move the water to Thornton from the WISC system. Around 74 miles of pipeline and conveyance infrastructure. We're hoping to have the water delivery phased beginning in that project in 2027. And what I mean by phased is we're not bringing all of the water from all of these farms down at once. It's a slow conversion, probably over the next 40 years, that'll match with Thornton's water demand. And then in 2018, we started this Northern Property Stewardship Plan. And that's primarily what I'm going to be talking about today, but I wanted to give you lots of context because all these pieces interplay. And what we're doing with that plan is we're seeking community input on what the future of Thornton's properties could look like in order to meet both Thornton's water supply goals as well as the local community's land use objectives. So 3 kind of separate legs of a stool. You probably by now you know that water people like to talk about legs of stools. So we have the water court decree, which governs our water rights and how we can use them. We have the Thornton Water Project, which is a construction pipeline project where we have to go through certain local regulatory processes. And then we have our stewardship plan. This is, like I said, a voluntary, community-informed property management and divestiture strategy. Everybody always wants to talk about the water project. I'm gonna spend about 18 seconds on it. That's not what my presentation is about, but long story short, we're constructing the pipeline in the north-south segments through Weld County. We have all the approvals that we need in order to do that. We do not yet have approval to construct the east-west conveyance out of Larimer County. So that is still being worked through. But as I mentioned before, we're hoping to have the project operational by 2027. And that is all I will say about the pipeline. So the Northern Property Stewardship Plan, here's kind of our objective or vision statement. It's a complementary process to our ag to municipal water transfer. We have to use the water rights in accordance with our water court decree. We want to use the water rights to meet our growing demand. The Thornton residents invested in this water portfolio, so it's their asset, and we need to bring that water down for future growth. So the stewardship plan is kind of a complementary all of these things, and it's really looking towards a future of what those properties can look like after Thornton meets its decree requirements. So when we first embarked on the stewardship plan, we interviewed a handful of subject matter experts in the area, local land use planners, water experts, agricultural experts. We kind of told them what we were up to, and we asked them all kinds of questions about what they thought the challenges were and what they'd like to see for the area, how they thought Thornton's properties could help meet those challenges. All sorts of things. And we really came up with these 5 calls to action that we heard from kind of these initial interviews from the community. The region's agricultural heritage and contribution is immensely important. And so it's important to try to maintain that. At the same time, the agricultural economies are diversifying and transitioning. There is a lot of pressure on ag. Not just Thornton, right? Not just Thornton's presence up there, but a lot of pressure. And so how could Thornton's properties, instead of being seen as kind of this constraint, how could we actually help stabilize this transition in ag and this transition in economies? Having such a large land presence up there could be seen on one hand as controlling, but on the other hand, it could really be seen as an opportunity because we can stabilize certain things as the region transitions, and that's really what we're hoping we'll get out of the stewardship plan. We also heard that it's really important to promote economic diversification, support ag, but also allow the areas to grow economically so that they've got more diversity. 1 million residents by 2040 is what the demographer's projecting. That's a lot of pressure on northern Colorado. And so, how can Thornton's properties help address a future that has that kind of population? And then, how can we be kind of a convener, a facilitator for regional approaches to land and water planning and land and water management? We really have no interest in master planning and having Thornton master plan northern Colorado. We really want to be a facilitator, a stabilizer, and we want to be able to use this process to kind of convene this regional approach. It doesn't really exist up there. I think you guys are probably aware of that. The individual municipalities are doing their individual planning. Larimer County has a different planning philosophy than Weld County does as it relates to the non-municipal areas. So is there a way that we can kind of help facilitate a little bit more regional approach to help the region meet its goals? So after we heard our experts, we embarked on this stewardship planning process, which is about an 18-month planning process. And it is guided by a group of what we call our steering committee. And it's a group of around 25 people. Put up the list of folks on the screen now. I just can't express enough gratitude towards these folks for the commitment that they have put into this process. We're about halfway through right now. The creativity, the open-mindedness, the advocacy in some instances. We think we got a really nice, diverse group of stakeholder interests to help us kind of inform this process. And then you'll kind of see the Thornton team on the right. Like I said, grateful for these folks, and they're not the only contributors. We've had some additional community outreach, and I would just invite anybody on this call to reach out to me if you'd like to engage with this process more, because we really want to make sure that we're hearing from as much of the community as we can. This is our schedule. As I said, we're kind of right in the middle. We spent the first third of our steering committee meetings just getting everybody oriented. We spent the second phase kind of on a land use activity as well as a water optimization study. And we're just wrapping up that second phase. And then this third phase is really going to be where the plan kind of becomes documented. It's not a rigid plan, it's an evolving plan. It's kind of it's like I said, it's hopefully going to be the recipe for how we can proceed. So that's kind of where we're at with this. So I just want to show you some of the data that has come out of this study so far. So you're very much kind of in the thick of this with us right now. But this map, I think, is really interesting. What our team did was basically pull all of the comprehensive plans from the communities that are near, within, adjacent to Thornton's properties. So not to discard Fort Collins here, but we don't have a lot of, Fort Collins is on the west side, kind of just grayed out. You can see none of our properties are in the town proper. So we didn't get in, their comp plan is obviously extremely robust and detailed. And so we kind of just blocked that out because it doesn't quite apply. But what you can see is Larimer County, the towns of Timnath, Windsor, Severance, Eaton, Pierce. This is kind of what they see as their future. It might be kind of hard for you to read. The yellow that you see everywhere is low density residential. The kind of light green that you see is continued agriculture. Red is commercial, kind of a brownish color is high density residential. So this is what these communities comp plans, this is what they think they're going to be growing into. And then once again, you see Thornton's properties layered on top of those. So you'll see some areas where, where a Thornton property is sitting on top of a yellow area that is low residential density. You'll see other areas where Thornton properties are in the continued irrigated ag, or continued ag, I should say, not necessarily irrigated. So this just gives you a sense of what the objectives are of the communities up there and how Thornton's properties might help achieve those objectives. Also where there might be some conflicts.
So Emily, we have a question, and Sally, why don't you go ahead and unmute and ask your question?
Thank you. Hi, Emily. Thanks so much. So my question, well, first of all, I just wanted to say I was looking at your stewardship steering committee. You have a lot of really great regional leaders on that committee that are trusted. So I was really, great to see that. My question is, can you give some examples of stabilization and economic diversification in the region that this would bring?
Well, that's actually the sort of questions that we're asking our steering committee. So I'll give you an example of something that came up recently, and that was dairies. Okay, so dairies are extremely important to the region. They are a big economic driver. A lot of Thornton's properties, as well as the other existing irrigated land, is being used to grow things that support the dairies, right? And so so that's one of that's kind of rising to the top as an important value. And so how can Thornton and the communities make some land use decisions so that we know that we are going to that there's going to continue to be enough product for the dairies to thrive. Another thing that came up kind of closer to the Larimer County thing was there's a really big local food movement, right? Locally grown food, not just production, but food. And so how can Thornton's properties be used to maybe support those kinds of goals? So I hope that helps, but those are that's the sort of information we're asking our steering committee to bring to the table and others. What do you see is going on? Like, what kind of industries do we need to watch out for, to make sure that they can be supported? Solar is really important to some communities and is completely, isn't interesting to other communities, I should say that. So we're trying to kind of understand what those objectives and goals are. Is that helpful?
Emily. Yes, thank you.
Okay, you bet.
So it's basic. I mean, really, it's a process that you're still working through. Yeah.
Oh, it's a process that we're working through. And then even when we get the plan printed and bound, it is still going to be a process. And the way that I'm hoping it'll work in practice with Thornton is that, we get calls all the time from people wanting to buy our properties. And what I'm hoping that we'll be able to do once this plan has kind of been adopted is someone will call, they'll say, hey, I want to build a skyscraper on this property. We'll pull out this plan and we'll say, whoa, that really doesn't fit the regional objectives for this property. Folks thought it was going to be low residential use. So it'll help inform those kinds of decisions. And so that we can make sure that whatever decisions we make about the future of the properties is in alignment to the extent possible. I mean, I'm not naive, there's going to be some conflicts, but is in alignment with the future goal.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Thank you.
You bet.
Scott has a question.
Yeah, I just, obviously all of those land uses that you're talking about will require an amount of water. And so I'm just wondering, is Thornton also looking at reserving some of their water to stay with those future land uses?
So a couple of thoughts as it relates to that question. It's an excellent question and a really important one. One of the things, Thornton, this water was purchased by Thornton for its residents. And so we need to be able to use the amount of water that is required to meet those future demands. If there is excess, which as of right now, it doesn't look like there will be in the long term, we'll be able to talk about what that excess is. What we do have some flexibility around is the timing of when the water is pulled from the farms and which farm it is pulled from. So as it relates to residential development or non-ag development, I should say, the water question gets particularly sticky. And we're trying to at least see if we can quantify it, like on a mass balance standpoint. Like, here's the water that is being removed by Thornton and all the other municipalities, which you'll see on the next slide. How much water is left for residential, or, as it relates to continued irrigated ag, that's where this water optimization study, which is the second piece of the property process, comes in. What we're hoping to do with that is see if there are ways to kind of optimize water supplies so that really key pieces of irrigated farmland can stay in irrigation as long as possible. And that's all I'm going to say right now with that, just because I'll get to the water optimization in a little bit. So, we're not going to solve the water problem with this, but I'm hoping that we'll understand it better. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to use kind of that understanding to move forward, if that makes sense. So I think I very skillfully dodged that hard question.
Thank you.
Yeah. So this is a really interesting map. What you see here, you're kind of getting familiar, I think, with this region. All of the colorful parts of this map generally represent the WISC system. The question before about how much ownership does Thornton have in the WISC system was, I said just under half. So you see Thornton's properties in pink. What you see in yellow is all of the other properties where the water has been purchased by municipal water suppliers. So those municipal water suppliers include Greeley, Fort Collins, the Tri-Districts, United Water and Stand. So you can see that Thornton isn't the only game in town at all. We are very much the dominant one and kind of the single largest one, but you can see the WISC system in general is really heavily impacted by municipal transfers. So what that does is that kind of spins me into the next slide that talks a little bit about this water optimization study. So one of the very early pieces of information we pulled was soil classifications, right? So this is just one way to look at productive farmland. There's a billion ways to look at productive farmland. This is just kind of for illustrative for purposes. And it was the first thing, one of the first things we pulled. So what you see in green is really high producing, high value soils that are conducive to really high producing ag. What you see in red are soils that are more challenging, right? So they might be poorer soils, they might be in areas, you'll see some drainages moving through here. So what we're thinking is, is there a way to kind of keep these prime farmlands in production for as long as possible, if not perpetuity, either by staging the timing at which Thornton pulls the water from its farms, or Thornton's decree actually allows re-irrigation of farms if a different source of water is brought to the table. So what the water optimization study is doing is kind of looking to see if there's a market-based solution to this. Like, could you have a farmer with a low, poor soils? I'm just going to simplify things. Apologies to the farmers in the room. You have a farmer with poor soils that wants to continue farming, and his or her family does too, into the generations. Is there a way they could trade that poorer farmland for a farmland that Thornton owns in green, and keep that property in irrigation for a long time? And then we kind of trade properties. And is there a market for that sort of thing? Is there a way that we could subsidize that sort of thing without outside funding in order to keep this high production ag viable? So that's kind of a very simplified description of the water optimization study, which once again, we're like knee deep in. But our stewardship plan really does have these two primary objectives. The first is this land use assessment, which is kind of what I described, that our steering committee is in the process of now, looking at comp plans, talking with planners from the different communities, talking with conservation organizations, ag representatives. What do we want this land use to ultimately look like? And how do those goals interface with Thornton's properties? And then the second is this water optimization study, which is exciting and very challenging because of the limited water resources in the region, as well as the cost of water in the region makes it really difficult for agriculture to compete when they're up against municipalities. So those are the outcomes. I would be thrilled to hear from anybody on this call or anybody that you think I need to talk to. Like I said, we're right in the middle of 2 weeks ago. We went out and did some community meetings with some of the local stakeholders that aren't on our steering committee, but that we needed to hear from in very specific ways. If you feel like you're one of those, or someone that is, please reach out to me. And we'll get you engaged. And then the last thing I just wanted to say was, I mentioned that this is not Thornton master planning these communities for everybody's, for our benefit or anybody else's. This is really us facilitating this. And in order to do this, we thought it was really important to get some outside funding. Thornton is obviously providing some funding for this, as well as a lot of staff time, but we did get a grant from the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation under their Water Smart program, specifically for this water optimization piece. It's called a Water Marketing Strategy Grant. We got some great funding from the Colorado Water Conservation Board, both through their Colorado Water Plan Grant program, as well as their Water Supply Reserve Fund. The Department of Local Affairs kicked in some money to help us with an economic analysis. So we have a really, this is around a $550,000 planning effort. I think it's very robust. I'm really pleased with the community engagement that we've been able to do and support the steering committee that we have. Yeah, that's kind of all I have. And I think I saved a little bit of time for questions or discussion.
So Emily, I did put your email address in the chat. So if people
Perfect.
wanted to get a hold of you.
Yeah. Thanks, Jennifer. I always accidentally, when I unshare, I hang up sometimes. So I'm going to try to unshare and not. I think I did
gotcha.
it. Not
There you
not
go.
disconnect myself.
Okay. Good. Well, we do have a few minutes for some more questions. If anybody wants to jump in, just dive in.
We do have a website too. I'll put the website in the chat for our stewardship plan. It's okay. It's kind of up to date. We're working on it. But I'll go ahead and do that as well. So
One question for you. In the case of the water optimization study and the potential to kind of have a market swap between farms, does your decree allow other farm water to come in, or do you have to go back to water court in that case?
we have a re-irrigation provision in our decree, and it says that we can a property can be re-irrigated with non-Thornton water. So it seems like it could be re-irrigated with whisk water owned by another entity. It seems like it could be re-irrigated, like if Whisk went after some junior rights or something like that. Our decree is from 1998, so it's, it doesn't give us the perfect playbook to make that happen, but we're willing to try. We feel like if it meets the desires of the local community, that we hope that we would get some cooperation in trying to feel out this re-irrigation provision. So it's kind of we're kind of lucky that it has that. A lot of decrees don't have that. A lot of them specifically have like ATM type transactions. Others require just permanent dry up. That's it. Game over. So I think there's a good opportunity there, and hopefully we can capitalize on it.
Thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions for Emily? Okay. Well, thank you, Emily. I'm assuming I'm going to see you down next week at the Colorado Water Congress. Also assuming we don't have another snowstorm that sort of puts everything on hold. So
I know.
So
Yeah.
we'll see. So see you next week, I guess. And thanks for doing this.
You bet. Nice to
yeah.
see you all. Thanks for the invite.
Thanks. Okay, and for our final speaker today, we have Professor Tim Gates. Tim is a professor in civil and environmental engineering, and he has worked in water management and specifically ag water management pretty much for the entire career I've known him. And I did a little reflection on that. It's not quite 4 decades, Tim, but it's awful close to 4 decades. We were in the same doctoral program, different major professors at UC Davis, and I think I probably first met you in it's either 1983 or 1984, and I just realized, wow, that's a long time ago. So it's good to work with Tim again, and he's developed a wealth of knowledge and experience in his time at Colorado State University, and has worked on a really diverse array of issues associated with water management for agriculture. So with that, Tim, why don't you take over the screen and give us your presentation? Uh-oh.
Can't quite hear you.
Yeah. You're not on mute. Uh-oh, technical difficulties. If you go into, if you go to the team screen and you go into more, and you go under device settings, there are settings for the microphone array. If you have multiple microphones, that might be something you can check.
Let me try that.
Oh, you got it. There it is.
Is it okay now?
Yep.
Okay, great. Well, it's good to be able to spend some time with your group today. And I'd welcome you as I'm going along to ask any questions that might pop in your mind. And I'll try to see if I can share my PowerPoint presentation. Okay. I'm a lot more familiar with Zoom than I am Teams. Let's see. You're probably seeing my screen, aren't you?
Yep, we're seeing the whole screen.
Yep. Let me see if I can get the PowerPoint up. Now, do you see the PowerPoint slides?
Yep, that's great.
Okay, great. Well, the plate on the left was meant to represent the lunch that we were scheduled to have together earlier today. And it serves, I guess, as a reminder that agriculture is an essential industry. And this afternoon, we want to reflect a bit on water as an essential resource for agriculture. Am I still coming through?
Yes,
Yep, we
yes,
can
you
hear
are.
you.
Okay, just want to make sure I'm not hearing anything. So I don't want to keep going and then nobody can hear me. So, like any water use, water for agriculture can really only be properly understood when we see it in the context of the overall hydrologic cycle, and in relation to both natural water processes, many of which we see here on this diagram from USGS, and as well as human engineered and managed processes like municipalities or industries, for example, that might be positioned upstream of agricultural areas or downstream of those areas. And it turns out that agriculture is a major driver. It has, as they say, a large footprint in the hydrologic cycle. Now, if we think about the use of water in agriculture, we note that it is consumed in two different ways. First, it's incorporated into plants and into livestock that are raised, but it also is incorporated in to other features of the landscape like weeds and bare soil. And the consumptive use is not just what's brought into the tissues themselves of plants or animals, but it is also the evapotranspiration that occurs through the crop and or through weeds and bare soil. Now, the water that can't be supplied by direct precipitation has got to be taken out of streams or groundwater. That is, it's withdrawn from those natural reservoirs and moved into the agricultural area. But much of that water is moved back into the stream and aquifer system because only a small fraction, as we'll learn, of the flow inside an agricultural system is actually consumed. Now, it's useful to talk about two forms of consumption. One is what we commonly refer to as beneficial consumption. That is, it has economic, socioeconomic value, as opposed to non-beneficial consumption, which again might simply be transpiration by weeds, phreatophytes, direct evaporation off of bare soils, and things like that. Now, all this flow, both to and within and out of agriculture, is of course affected by overall goals and objectives that water users have, by the technology that is implemented for moving the water around and using it, and by a number of different constraints, social constraints, economic constraints, and of course, a very big constraint in our state and throughout the Western U.S. are constraints related to water laws. Now, the reason why agriculture has such a huge impact in the hydrologic cycle is because of the vast amount of water that it takes to produce economically valuable products in agriculture. So this just is an illustration of the total number of gallons that are needed to produce 1 pound of a variety of products, all the way from vegetables and fruits through cereal products, milk, animals, etc. And you can note there that there's a lot of water that's needed, both again for incorporation into the product itself, but also and primarily through evapotranspiration and processing in the case of livestock. Let's step back and take a look at irrigated agriculture, which of course is what really comes to mind most when we're thinking about water in agriculture in a place like Colorado. Let's step back and look at it globally. Around the world, there are about 630 million acres of irrigated ground. And that ground makes up only about 18% of the total agricultural land in the world. But as far as its value to producing, the food and the fiber that people need, it produces between 35 and 40% of the total crop productivity within the world. So again, when we think about decisions that are made with regard to moving water out of agriculture into other sectors, we need to always keep in mind how huge the weight is on the balance with regard to the value that agriculture has in producing what's needed for consumption within the world. Now, in order to do that, agriculture makes up about 70% of all the water that is withdrawn from both surface and groundwater resources around the world. And in that lower map, there is an illustration of the distribution of irrigated lands around the world. And you can see that the bulk of those lands are located in Asia and China, but we have a fair amount of irrigated land in the United States as well. In the US, as late as about 2017, it was estimated that there are about 58 million irrigated acres of ground. And if we take a look at the distribution of those irrigated acres and kind of try to get a sense for where Colorado sits, you'll notice that Colorado is the 6th largest of the irrigated states in the United States, surprisingly, Arkansas makes up a lot of irrigated land that irrigate a fair amount of rice in Arkansas, it turns out. But when we focus in on Colorado agriculture, we have a total of about 3.3 million acres of ground. And you can see a distribution of that irrigated land in the map. There's been a number of maps put up today showing irrigated ground within the South Platte and more specifically within the Cache-la-Poudre sub-basin of the South Platte. But we have a lot of ground spread out over the state. Most of it is in the eastern portion of our state. And a lot of it is irrigated by groundwater. If we look at the composition of irrigated land around the state and break it up by the river basins in our state, you can see that the South Platte Basin, where we sit, makes up about 26% of the total 3.3 million acres of irrigated land in Colorado. The second largest portion of irrigated land is in the Republican Basin. And then you can see that the Arkansas and the Rio Grande also make up quite a sizable portion of our irrigated ground. When we think about irrigation in Colorado in terms of just total quantities of water, the amount of water that is left within the state in any given year is over there on the right-hand side. You can see that we have about 8.2 million acre feet of water that leave our state and move into surrounding areas every year. But of the amount of water that's left over, the vast majority of it is used by agriculture. In fact, in Colorado, the latest estimate is that more than 90% is used for agricultural production. Now, in terms of where that water comes from, and I think Brett mentioned this a little bit earlier in his presentation, roughly 20% of the water is taken by wells out of groundwater, and 80% is diverted out of our streams, either directly out of the stream or indirectly out of reservoirs that are fed by streams. Just to give you again an idea of the value, when you look at the quantities, it's staggering to note how much water agriculture uses. But the bulk of the roughly $47 billion that agriculture generates in the state of Colorado on an annual basis is on irrigated land. One of the things that I've noted throughout my career in working with agricultural water and specifically with irrigation and drainage and its interaction with the natural hydrologic system, is that irrigation brings benefits that go beyond just expansion and sustainability of agricultural production. I love this photo that we were able to take in a project that I was working on a number of years ago in the Arkansas River Basin down in the southeast portion of our state. It shows the Fort Lyon Canal over on the left there, running along the bluffs of the desert on the north side of the Arkansas River Valley. And that's pretty much the way this area looked prior to the introduction of irrigation, was the way it looks to the left or to the north of the Fort Lyon Canal. But irrigation, has brought these expansive green vistas, let's say, these beautiful landscapes that spread across large tracts of our state, and it enhances the rural economies. It makes possible the rural lifestyle that personally I find quite appealing. But we also need to realize that irrigation can markedly alter the landscape as well, and the hydrologic environment, through the huge withdrawals that take place out of our streams and out of our aquifers as that water is then displaced and moved and spread over vast areas. And it has a marked impact also through the return flow that takes place off of irrigated lands back into the aquifers and back into the streams. Now, if we just ask, well, what's the overall objective that would guide the use of water in irrigated agriculture? I think a kind of a summary statement would be that we're out to get water to crops, but get it to the crops in the right amount, in the right quality, and in a timing that allows agriculture to be profitable, but that also protects the environment in which the agricultural enterprise is situated. And so when we think about how the tremendous energy, the tremendous human effort, the tremendous investment in infrastructure that goes into achieving these objectives, and we realize how large the quantities of water are that are used, we wonder, where does all this water go? So I want to just summarize for you briefly from our studies through the years here in Colorado, both ours and those that have been conducted by other researchers, how the water is apportioned. Now, let's break it down into two parts. Somebody mentioned earlier today that there are portions of our state that are irrigated using drip or trickle irrigation, and that's true, but it's a very, very small percentage. The vast majority of irrigation that's practiced in Colorado is by conventional surface irrigation, be it border, flood, or fur irrigation, and increasingly by sprinklers. So currently, surface irrigation makes up about 43% of the irrigated land in Colorado. An average of about somewhere between 20 and 30% of the water that we take out of rivers and tributaries into canals that are used to distribute the water to the irrigated fields, about 20 to 30% of that seeps out of those canals into the groundwater. Now, in urban areas, we often see canals that are running through neighborhoods, and they're often, although certainly not always, they're often lined with concrete or some other type of permanent liner. But the vast majority of canals throughout the state and around the world are still earthen because lining is very expensive. So a lot of water seeps into the groundwater. If we then take the water that is applied to irrigated fields from the canals, that is the water that's left over after the seepage leaves the canal, about 10 to 20% of that water runs off the surface of the field all the way down to the end, and usually is collected in a drain at the end of the field. About 20 to 30% of the water infiltrates into the soil and then passes through the root zone, the zone where the roots of the crop grow, down to a deeper level where it's no longer accessible to the crops. So that bottom line, somewhere between 50 and 70% of the amount that's applied to the fields is actually consumed by the crops. And again, that means evapotranspiration primarily, but also incorporation into the tissues of the growing crop itself. About 5 to 15%, we estimate, of the surface runoff that occurs and the seepage out of the canals and the deep percolation below the root zone ends up moving to positions on the landscape or within the aquifer where it is consumed by weeds or water-loving plants, or by just direct evaporation. And again, this composes what we'd often call non-beneficial consumption. So that bottom line, about 40 to 50% of the water that passed through a head gate, for example, out of a river and moved into the canal, actually makes its way back into the stream system. But as it does that, we need to also keep in mind that that water, as it moves over the surface and through the subsurface, picks up quite a number of minerals and materials that dissolve within the water and carries those solute loads back into the stream system and into the aquifer. When it comes to sprinkler irrigation, which makes up about 56% of the total irrigated ground in Colorado, this water is more often than not pumped directly out of groundwater, although there are a number of fields where the water is pumped out of a canal that takes it from the river into a pipeline that then sprinkles the water onto the field. But most of it comes directly out of groundwater. And of the water that's applied to fields using sprinklers, there really isn't much that runs off the surface. The vast majority of it infiltrates. And about 15 to 20% of that water then percolates down below the root zone and moves into deeper soils or into the water table, so that about, in the case of sprinkler irrigation, about 80 to 85% of the water is actually consumed by the crop. In the case of sprinkler irrigation, the amount of water that we would call non-beneficial consumption ends up being less than it is in surface irrigation, and we would say it probably ranges somewhere between 5 to 10%. So that in terms of return flows, you note that there is a marked decrease in the total quantity of water that makes its way off of these irrigated areas and back into the aquifer system, and in many cases streams that are connected hydraulically to the aquifer. But as was the case in surface irrigation, solutes are dissolved and the solute masses move around in the subsurface and into streams. Just to summarize a number of issues related to these solutes that are of major concern in an agricultural context. There are water quality concerns with regard to what is coming in to agriculture. And the main concerns are, number one, total dissolved solids, which we commonly refer to as salinity, as well as a number of specific dissolved solids that we refer to as specific ions. And those would be in particular like chlorides, boron, for example, that can be damaging in certain concentrations to crop production. There's a concern about microbial contamination. And so as exploration is done in the use of gray water, for example, in irrigation, and treated municipal water that may not be treated to a high enough level, there's always a concern about the potential for there being contamination of crops by microbes. On the output side, the water quality issues that we need to focus on are, again, salinity, because as salts build up in agricultural fields and in the underlying groundwater, they threaten crop productivity. Crops can only tolerate a certain concentration of salts before their yields begin to drop. There are a number of specific ions that are of concern in the runoff water that comes off of agriculture. A variety of different what we call anions, or negatively charged ions, as well as positively charged ions. There are trace elements. There are a number of locations around Colorado where, as irrigation water moves through the subsurface, it dissolves and mobilizes a variety of different elements like selenium and uranium and arsenic that can be damaging at high enough concentrations to aquatic life in streams, to livestock, and even in some cases to human health. Nutrients are present and can be a problem. Nitrate is of significant concern, and it derives primarily by the chemical reactions that occur as irrigation water picks up fertilizers that are used in agriculture. Pesticides can be moved out of the system by irrigation flows. And again, there can also be microbial contamination on the output side of irrigated agriculture. So I just wanted to go over briefly with you as we close our time here in a few minutes. Some major issues that Colorado agriculture faces right now with respect to water. And a number of these have been mentioned even today in some of the presentations that were made. And when I looked online at some of the discussions and talks that you've had over the last few months, I'm sure that they also brought up some of these topics. Obviously, a big issue that agriculture faces is the growing demand for water by municipalities, and in some cases, maybe industrial uses, particularly the energy sector. And there are also competing demands for in-stream flows. As we've mentioned, agriculture diverts a lot of water out of our streams, and there can be segments of our streams in Colorado where the flow rates left in the stream downstream of where the canals divert the water are quite small and can be a threat to the thriving of aquatic life. So these demands are pressuring agriculture with regard to its management of its water resources. Now, earlier today, Brett talked quite a bit about one way these things can be addressed is through alternative transfer methods. And I won't go over those because he did a great job summarizing a variety of different options that are being explored to try to meet some of these competing demands while at the same time preserving water in agriculture. I think Andy earlier today talked about the fact that many of the facilities and structures that are used to control and regulate water in our vast agricultural systems are very old and have deteriorated in some cases very significantly. So there is a need for investment in improving infrastructure, diversion structures, regulating structures, canal structures, etc. But also there's a need for boosting management. It's surprising how little careful measurement of irrigation water still takes place, or let's say does not take place here in our state. And so there's definitely a lot of room for improvement. We mentioned non-beneficial consumption. One of the things that happens as a result of the fact that irrigation is not perfectly efficient. There's always more water applied, certainly in the case of surface irrigation. In contrast to sprinkler, more irrigation water applied than is actually used by the crop. What happens, it goes into the soil, passes down through the root zone, and causes the groundwater table, the groundwater level under the ground to rise. And as that water table rises, it gets up close to the ground surface as it spreads out, not just under the irrigated land, but under adjacent non-irrigated or naturally vegetated areas. And the higher that water level is, the easier it is for water to be drawn up or wick up through the soil to meet evaporative demands and transpiration demands of weeds and so forth that are growing on non-productive ground. And so what happens is a lot of water as a result of inefficient irrigation just moves out of many of our river basins into the atmosphere and is lost for economic consumption, at least for the time being, until it returns in the form of precipitation. Salinity, as we mentioned, is a significant problem that's faced on irrigated lands all over the world. It's been around a long time, and it's certainly a problem we grapple with here in Colorado in a number of our river basins, because as water is used by the crop through evapotranspiration, the water that's left behind is concentrated. The salts that are present grow in their concentration, and it becomes harder for the crop to extract the water that is needed because of the impacts that highly saline water in the soil has on the ability of the crop to take up the water with its roots. And then non-point source pollution. As excess irrigation flows both over the surface, but primarily through the subsurface, make their way back to the hydrologic system, they pick up salts, they pick up these trace elements that we mentioned earlier. They pick up pesticides and fertilizers that come off of the agricultural land, and they move these solutes deeper into groundwater formations as well as into the streams that are connected to the aquifers. And so all of these issues, the non-beneficial consumption, the salinity, the non-point source pollution, are integrally tied to this topic of return flow, where the excess water moves and how it moves and its timing. And that, of course, is connected to water rights that determine how management or infrastructure changes can be made to try to reduce non-beneficial consumption or reduce salinity or reduce non-point source pollution. They constrain the decisions that we can make about mitigating those problems, because when we do so, we change the return flows, and the return flows under Colorado water rights law are deemed a resource for use by other water rights holders further downstream. And so just to make the point here and kind of give you a sense of the challenge that is faced in trying to address some of these problems, while at the same time dealing with the impact that improved management practices, or what we sometimes call best management practices, have on return flows. It's useful to think a little bit about all the processes that are involved in an irrigated area in relation to irrigation return flows and the solutes that are transported both over the surface and under the ground in those return flows. So here I've just tried to list a few things, not going into any detail, but there are a lot of both flow and water quality issues that have to be considered. The application of the water, the amount that runs off the surface, the amount that seeps out of the canals and where it happens, the deep percolation and its distribution, the energy state that occurs as water levels are higher in one area and lower in another, and how that tends to advect the water through the system. Diffusion and dispersion as water spreads through formations and cracks at both the larger and smaller scales. Evaporative concentration processes, a variety of different chemical reactions, dissolution, and the opposite, which is how solutes precipitate back out into solid form, the absorption of solutes into soils, the volatilization that can occur as solutes move from liquid into gaseous form and move out of the system. And all these things have to be accounted for when decisions are made in large agricultural regions with regard to changing the way we manage irrigation water deliveries and applications and drainage of that water. So just a map here just to illustrate this, that whenever we implement best management practices, we're going to change the rates and the patterns of the return flows, which in turn, by its connection through the groundwater and directly to the stream, affects the flows in the rivers themselves. So with that summary, I'd be happy to answer any questions or discuss any of these topics further.
Thank you, Tim. That was very comprehensive. I think you covered everything there, except maybe the water the farmer drinks in the house or something. I don't know. Okay. Yeah, so we've got time for a few questions if people want to ask Tim anything.
Tim, you could probably stop sharing because I think we're getting multiple images here. Tim, I have a question for you. I really appreciated you ending on the return flows analysis, because that's so counterintuitive for people, that if we're more efficient in our agriculture practices, doesn't that put more water in the river? And I appreciate the fact that you showed how it affects the river, and that's the hardest thing I think for people to understand.
Yeah, and again, I think the topic of how to best understand the impact that a variety of these choices that we have to make about reallocating water and even making irrigation more efficient has on return flows is one of the biggest difficulties in making final decisions with regard to some of these options that are before us. Because again, it relates, Jennifer, not only to rates and quantities and timing of flows, but also to water quality.
Yeah, and Tim, I also liked you were, I mean, addressing the situation with return flows, but also, you know, discussing the issue with the groundwater buildup. And it's one of the things that in working in this kind of topical area across much of the irrigated West, it was kind of frustrating because, you know, when we think about the issue of water use efficiency in using surface water versus groundwater, you know, you can be in a situation where, you know, the Ogallala, you want to be as efficient as possible. But in the South Platte, there's some serious economic and even ecological benefits with being, quote unquote, inefficient with your water, because what you're doing is slowing the water down on the landscape. And it seems to be, how should I say, that that subtlety and distinction is often not discussed and appreciated in ag water management, and rather it either is we should be as efficient as possible or we should try to slow it down without really thinking about where are we getting the water from, what are we trying to accomplish, you know, that type of thing. And so that is something to really kind of emphasize, that you know, where the water is coming from and what you're trying to accomplish results in, how should I say, there's tools, but they're not solutions. That is, efficiency is a tool, but it's not necessarily a solution for everything.
Yes, absolutely. And it's the issue is not simply total quantities that change when we alter efficiencies, but timing of those flows, as you mentioned, John. The vast irrigation that takes place in many of our large alluvial valleys in Colorado has changed the flow patterns in these rivers for now well over a century. When you take water and you move it into canals and you distribute it over tens, if not hundreds of thousands of acres of ground, and it slowly percolates down into the ground. Some of that water, for example, down in the Arkansas River, that's applied out of canals that might be 5 to 10 miles away from the river, take decades to make their way back to the river system. And so, yeah, when you start talking about changing efficiencies, there are a lot of things that have to be considered.
Yep. Okay. Good. Are there any other questions for Tim? Well, we're right on time, and Tim, thank you. Thank you for being willing to step in and discuss this topic. Hand clap, virtual hand clap.
Thank you.
And now we can move on to wrapping up with the day. So Benton and Jennifer, could you give the class their assignments or any final discussion that we want to have on overall for the day, or just want to move into kind of the assignments for the next session, the February class?
Well, I actually thought Tim did a great job of summing up the day. So I think we can just remind everybody about homework assignments, and you found out that Benton is a greasy, knows how to work a wheel, and he'll be on your, you know what, if we don't get your homework in. So appreciate Benton working hard at that. I think it's an important piece. And I encourage all of you to go to our website because you then can see, although I think you send it out to them, Benton, right? All the comments?
The
All their
comments
homework
as in-
assignments?
Yes.
Do we share that with everybody?
Yep. We share the redacted version
Right.
on the website with everybody.
Okay, so if you go to the website, you can see how your classmates felt about what we were saying and what they thought about it and what questions they had. So just a reminder to do that. And John, that's all I had. So.
Oh, okay. Well, thanks everyone, and thanks for the swift adjustment to a virtual meeting. Next month, we're going to meet in the regular location, barring a snowstorm again. So hopefully we'll be able to be in person then. And I forgot the lineup. Benton, can you kind of cover the topic? I realized I just didn't bring that up. So what's the general topic for the next session?
So we're looking at recreation next month.
Okay. Which is an interesting topic. And for those of you, I know we have many of you that may be attending Colorado Water Congress next week. And so for those of you there, we'll see you there and we'll say hi.
And by the way, on that subject, if you wanted to attend it personally, they've capped out. So, but you can attend virtually. So there is that option.
Okay, good. Okay, well, thanks everyone, and get those snow shovels out and make sure your sidewalks are clear or you're going to get a citation.
That's what I'm off to do right now.
Okay.
See y'all.
Thank you.
Stay
See ya.
warm.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Thanks. Have a good day.
Bye.
Bye.